Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm your host, Meghan Grebner, with us as always to talk all things markets. University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Our program this week is brought to you by the Feedstuff Finder from the University of Missouri. Feedstuff Finder was developed by the University of Missouri Extension with funds by the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center and the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. You can find out more about the Feedstuff Finder by checking out the link in the weekly livestock market newsletter that will come out tomorrow morning. Scott, this week we're going to talk some jobs. We're going to talk a little trade data, which I think is really interesting to talk about that pork number as we're getting going in 2024. And the big report out today, which is supply and demand numbers from the USDA. But to kick things off, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, Megan, on the cattle side this week, live fed cattle were $1.85 higher this week. That puts them $20 above where they were a year ago at this time. Those feeder cattle markets were also higher again this week, up $3 to $6 higher. On the futures side, the April live cattle futures contract was down 65 cents, and the April feeder contract was down $4.25. We did see May corn futures go up 15.5 cents this week, which I think helped push feeder cattle futures lower. The choice box beef price was up $2.70 on the week, now setting $19.40 above year-ago level. On the hog side, cash barrels and gilts were up 65 cents this week. The April lean hog futures contract was down $3.30. We gained 50 cents on the pork cutout value this week.
It's definitely been interesting, and I feel like I'm a little out of the loop when we're talking about what's been happening in terms of prices just in general. There's really seems to be a little bounce back on the cash hog side of things after so many weeks that we've been talking about pressure and lower prices.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, as you point out, it's gotten better than where we certainly started the year. You know, the first week of 24, 68.25 was the price we saw, and this week we're looking at nearly $80. So it's been a nice ride back up, and I think helped what was otherwise tougher profitability for hog producers.
And that's going to be a pretty, maybe not a complete comeback story on the pork side of things, but if we're looking at lower input prices, and we'll talk about that coming up in a little bit as well, there's probably some opportunity for some risk management on the hog side of things, I would assume.
Yeah, so this is where I think, you know, we often talk LRP in cattle. Things like LRP in hogs might be in order. So we've gotten a nice run up, taking advantage of those opportunities to lock in some higher hog prices. May be an opportunity that some producers want to take advantage of. So we probably haven't hit on that as much on the hog side, and now may be the opportunity, just as we're going to need to watch on the feed cost side as well. Although corn futures were up this week, we've certainly seen general weakness. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about nearby corn futures being below $4.
All right, let's take a look at those slaughter numbers for this week. Kind of a pullback on both cattle and hogs.
Yeah, smaller runs on both sides. USDA tells us for the week ending March 9th, 583,000 head of cattle. So we're continuing to see a slowing there. That's down 16,000 head relative to last week, down 48,000 relative to a year ago. And lower runs on the hog side as well, which I've been hearing interest in from packers and trying to get more hogs. A run of 2.456 million head this week. That's 93,000 head less than we ran last week, and 52,000 less than we ran a year ago. And it's been a while since you and I have been able to talk about year ago levels, or being below year ago levels in terms of hog slaughter.
Jobs report out this week. As we take a look at those February numbers, interesting talking about more jobs, but then also to take a look at that unemployment rate.
Yeah, so we added 275,000 jobs in February, which exceeded the pre-report 198,000 that was being expected. So on that side of the ledger, I think we got good news. Although we did see the unemployment rate jump from 3.7 to 3.9% in the report as well. So a little bit of mixed bag in terms of what we got out of the jobs report this morning.
Monthly trade data out this week, and we'll talk beef first, but I think a really great part of that story is what's going on the pork side of things as well.
Yeah, so on the beef side, export side first here, overall January beef exports down 10 million pounds for January of this year relative to a year ago levels. Japan down, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan down, Mexico was up, South Korea down slightly. So we're seeing, I think, as our beef prices continue to be at high levels, some pullback in terms of exports of beef out of the United States. I think the other side of this beef story is the import side of the story. In January of 23, we imported 365 million pounds of beef into the United States. January of 24, we went to 503.6 million pounds, up 38%. Brazil, Australia, New Zealand were really the big players in terms of additional imports. Those three alone were 128 million pounds above what they did a year ago.
I'm not going to gloss over the beef imports number now. I'm going to wait until we talk a little bit about supply and demand numbers, because that is a very big number in 2023. And I don't think that that's going to change. So we're going to hold that thought for just a second. Now, as we take a look at pork exports for the start of 2024, that story is one that is definitely hitting high notes this week.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about what was 588 million pounds of pork exported out of the United States in January of this year, up 5.8% relative to a year ago. That's the good news story in terms of what's going on the pork side of the equation. Just to keep this in perspective, we exported 23.8% of our January production. So I think that's also been helpful to where prices have gone. Now, when you look at the mix of this, I think this is also very interesting. Hats off to the pork industry for what's been happening, building new markets. So Mexico up 3% this January relative to a year ago. Japan basically really unchanged. South Korea also up about 22 million pounds. China down 30 million pounds. But all other destinations, so we tend to lop a bunch of other countries together. Those other countries up 32 million pounds this month relative to a year ago. Just reminds me to say, we're building some new markets on that pork trade side. I think that has long-term benefits to the industry.
I know groups like the U.S. Meat Export Federation work really hard to explore new markets. Colombia, Central Latin America has been a target, and those are great opportunities, and great if you think about the foods that are cooked there as well. Like, what a great vehicle for those Latin flavors in pork, and hats off to the checkoff and the U.S. Meat Export Federation for the hard work they're doing to grow those other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the win on all fronts. When you diversify to a number of other countries, I think it helps from a risk management side. We often might think about trade being more volatile, but the more countries that we're trading with on the pork side, I think we can spread that risk out a little bit more, maybe a little less volatility. So it is a long-term, not just what we're doing today, but I think it's a long-term win as we grow those new markets for U.S. pork.
All right, so let's talk supply and demand numbers, and then we're going to get into this conversation about beef and imports as well. So as you take a look at beef production for March and USDA's numbers that came out today, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so USDA did raise their 2024 beef production estimate. They came in at nearly 26.4 billion pounds. That was up 140 million pounds from what they would have said in February. And put it in perspective, although 2024 beef production will still be down, they're now calling it to be down 2.4% relative to what we did in 2023. So been raising those estimates. So more beef supplies. We'll see how that plays out as we go through 2024, but that's a change relative to what we've been seeing.
As we take a look at beef, pork, and chicken production overall, how is USDA setting that up?
Yeah, so they also increased the production of the sum of those three meats by nearly 270 million pounds in March relative to February. Right at 100.7 billion pounds of those three meats. When you look at that 2024 estimate relative to last year, it's now a 0.5 percentage point higher. I think if you go back a few months, you might find the sum of those three meats for 2024 to be projected to be below 2023. So growing slightly, the total production relative to last year.
That's not the only thing that USDA is increasing.
That is true. We certainly see on the trade side. So two things, one more positive than the other. Increasing pork exports by 50 million pounds. That certainly is, I think, in response to what we've been seeing of late in terms of the monthly trade data. So that's helpful to the pork market. Increasing beef imports by 50 million pounds. That's now 4.2 billion pounds of beef imported into the United States. I don't want to be too negative about that. It's a big number, not surprising when we've had record beef prices. And it's also going to be lean ground beef to go with some of the fat we might be producing out of fed cattle that in some ways will be helpful at the end of the day.
So as we take a look at that, we're talking about beef imports that increased 38%, as we talked about in terms of monthly trade data. We're talking about beef imports being raised by 50 million pounds. Part of that is because what? We like hamburgers, right?
And ground beef prices have been fairly high, trying to pull it in additional product. And you know, when you look at a beef import graph, Meghan, for a period of time, we've kind of been in this 250 to 350 million pounds a month. And when in January we brought in 500 million pounds, that's a big leap in that monthly data. So we'll see if that continues as we go forward. But ground beef prices continue to be fairly strong right now.
How much of this is cyclical as well? Thinking about we have tighter supplies, but other parts of the world, thinking Australia has been on a climb because it was in a drought period and contraction when we had a larger herd. How does that kind of fit together in this global trade picture?
Yeah, so it's not surprising when you see an Australia in particular who's, as you say, a few years ago, dealing with drought, reducing cattle inventories now that they've been building, trying to find homes. I think that's also affecting our ability to trade product with Japan as Australia starts to get back in that market. If you look back at livestock slaughter for January, we were talking about beef cow slaughter down when we talked about that a week or so ago. And I think that's tightened up ground beef supplies as well. When you're down 10, 11% in beef cow slaughter for the first month of 2024 relative to where it was a year ago, I think all that just suggests more imports trying to come in to fill the gap. And that's what we're doing. So beef production will be down this year. This idea of exporting less and importing more reduces the gap or the decline that consumers see in this country in terms of available beef supplies.
How much are we watching what happens in terms of imports? You bring up a good point, beef cow slaughter. Thinking about if we start maybe starting to think about expansion, depending on whether does that potentially force us to need to import some more as well as we're trying to retain heifers and keep, cows back long term?
Yeah, so the point that you're raising is a critical one. We haven't got in this point of the cycle where we're trying to grow inventory. When you see 40% of the on-feed inventory still being heifers today, I think we have a lot of cattlemen who are saying, I don't want to breed that heifer. She's worth too much. She's going to the feed yard today. When that changes, that's another cut in production that will need to be somehow, well, higher prices will be part of what happens, I think, but can we bring in more product to help offset some of the loss of that beef production? And I think from a ground beef perspective, the answer is yes. So I think beef imports will continue to be strong as we go through much of 2024.
I think it's interesting just talking about how everything is so cyclical, right? On the pork side of things, we're talking about increased pork exports on the global market, largely because another part of the world, thinking about the EU and their pork production, has been struggling, right, in recent months.
Yeah, so I say still we have the comparative advantage. It's in some ways different as we talk about cattle and hogs, I think, but I say from a hog perspective, there aren't other countries that are going to jump in and want to trade more product, probably as much as we would like to. So I think we do have the comparative advantage. I'll say on the cattle side, I think what we still have going for us is U.S. beef is seen as different than beef in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. And hats off to the beef industry of creating a premium product viewed globally as that premium product, because I think that helps us in these periods of high prices not to see even larger declines in beef exports than what we've seen. We're up in value terms in January with that trade data relative to where we were a year ago.
One last thing on the supply and demand side of things. We'll end on a positive note. As you take a look at what USDA did in terms of, I say a positive note, at least in terms of input cost, what USDA did for corn prices this month.
Yes, so corn prices down a nickel, 475 is what USDA is now telling us for the season average for what we harvested last fall. The other bit of good news here that is important, so they raised steer prices by $3. They raised barrel and gilt prices by a dollar as well. So we're seeing some better margins, and I think for pork producers in particular, seeing both of those higher pork prices maybe for 2024 and cheaper feed makes the outlook a little bit brighter than it was when we started 2024.
All right, that'll do it for us this week. As we take a look to next week, we'll talk a little bit on the demand side of things. Retail prices, consumer sentiment. What are you watching for most next week?
Well, so I think on the retail prices side, just continuing to watch what we get in terms of beef price levels. We're going to be pushing high prices at consumers. Just how much higher will those prices go as we go through 2024? We know that we certainly are reducing slaughter numbers on a weekly basis. It tells me beef supplies will keep tightening up. Just how much more are we going to see higher prices? Does that eventually get consumers to be worried about or switch the amount of beef they're willing to consume? That's where we're going to watch retail prices all year long, I think, Megan. And then just overall consumer sentiment. Do we see some positives as we look ahead? I always go, for us, meat demand, what's income going to be like? And when I say income, what's the general economy going to do? What's consumer debt going to do? That all matters to the consumption of meat. And then just what's going to happen to these retail prices. Those are the two pieces of the puzzle that we really need to watch on the demand front here in 2024.
Scott, always great to see you. We'll touch base and check in with you again next Friday.
Sounds good, Megan.
Our program is brought to you by the Feed Stuff Finder from the University of Missouri. To find out more information, make sure to click the box in our weekly Livestock Market update newsletter that will come out on Saturday morning. Have a great weekend. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.